Aristotle had a much more holistic, holistic view of the good life, where he incorporated generosity, giving, kindness. He spent a lot of time talking about politics and how we are relative to other people as important elements of happiness. And this is a kind of scholarship we need today. And again, scholarship not as an end in itself, scholarship as a means towards an end, which is another Aristotelian focus. What is how do you actually use this for the purpose of bettering your life? This is, what the Greeks in general, not just Aristotle, were focused on, the good life, and unashamedly so.
Hello, this is Robinson Earhart, here with the introduction to Robinson's podcast, number 131. And this episode is with Tal Ben-Shahar. And Tal did his undergraduate and graduate work at Harvard, where he later lectured on positive psychology and taught the most popular course in the university's history. And he's now a speaker and writer who focuses largely on happiness, and included in that, positive psychology. So Tal and I talk about the interdisciplinary field of happiness studies, which he's been developing for the better part of half a decade, and which draws on such disparate areas of academia as neuroscience and history and literature and anthropology to pull together a cohesive understanding of what happiness is. We start off by discussing Aristotle, who Tal thinks of as the father of happiness. And then after we get into Tal's own framework for the factors involved in happiness, we move on to how various disciplines, like the ones I've just mentioned, so neuroscience, anthropology, philosophy, can teach us about happiness in different ways. And at the end of the episode, Tal gives some practical advice for improving the quality of one's life. There are links in the description to Tal's website and his Twitter. And I always have to mention that comments, likes, subscribes, follows, all of those things are endlessly appreciated. And now, without any further ado, I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I enjoyed having it with Tal. I saw that as we were just talking about, you did your undergraduate work in philosophy and psychology. And what I'm wondering right at the outset is, at that point, were you already fascinated with positive psychology on the one hand, and then on the other, the ancient traditions of philosophy, or Eastern traditions even, of philosophy concerned with happiness? And I suppose what I'm asking, just to make it more clear, is just when it was first that happiness became the focus of your research and career, and second, like the synthesis of a variety of approaches to happiness.
Yeah, so positive psychology as a field only came about in 1998. So this was after I'd already graduated as an undergraduate, but I was interested in philosophy and psychology from a relatively young age, simply because, I thought this is where I could find answers. I didn't really know where to look for the answers, but I thought, okay, philosophy, they ask the big questions. Psychology, it's about the psyche. I think I'll go for both so that I can get some answer to my plea, really. Which is, how can I become happier? Because I wasn't happy growing up. I wasn't happy as an undergraduate student. I started off as a computer science major, and it was only later that I turned to philosophy and psychology. So I really, really was desperate, and I wanted to look anywhere, everywhere, where I thought maybe I could find the answers. And fortunately, I did find at least some of the answers in these two fields.
So, as you just said, you were interested in answers, but was it just to the big questions, or was it just to questions about happiness already then that you were quite focused on because of your disappointing undergraduate career?
Yeah, well, it was There were big questions for me. The big question for me was, why am I miserable? And, another big question was not just for me, for everyone, why are we here? What's the purpose of it all? Because I did have some, very nihilistic musings, as again, many people do. So it was these questions, and Socrates encouraged me, because he says, I know that I don't know. I certainly knew that I didn't know, and I thought, he's the father of Western philosophy. I'll look at what he has to say. And then I discovered Aristotle, and for me that was a game changer. Even today when I teach happiness, I teach Aristotle as the father of the field of happiness studies. And I remember when I first read Nicomachean Ethics, I thought, wow, someone so over 2,500 years ago had these thoughts, and I could actually feel like I was walking beside him in his in his school, in his lyceum, and I thought, he's talking to me. And there was no turning back after Aristotle.
Good. Well, I think maybe we should return to those two questions. Why were you miserable, and why are we here, at the end of our conversation, after we've discussed some of the elements of happiness studies. But you said that you teach Aristotle as the father of happiness studies. And maybe a good place to start then is, what is the difference between positive psychology, which is naturally a branch of psychology, and this synthesis of other fields that is happiness studies?
Right. So the difference between the two became very clear to me in 2015, when a question came to mind. So until that time, just for context, I had been essentially doing positive psychology. That's the course I taught. That is what I wrote about. I was part of that field from the very beginning, as a graduate student, 1998. So 1998, 2015, basically 100% positive psychology. And then 2015, a question came to mind, and the question was, how is it that there is a field of study for psychology, for philosophy, for history, for medicine, biology, geography, you name it, but there's no field of study for happiness? Yeah, it's true that there is a positive psychology, but that's just the psychology of happiness. What about what philosophers like Aristotle or Lao Tzu had to say about happiness? What about what economists had to say about happiness, or neuroscientists, or literature? Chinua Achebe has a lot to say about happiness. Shakespeare has a lot to say about happiness. What about what film has to say about happiness? One of my favorite courses as an undergrad was with the philosopher Stanley Cavell, who taught a course, it was a core class by the name of The Pursuits of Happiness, where every week we would watch a movie. His Girl Friday, Lady Eve, North by Northwest, great movies, and talk about happiness. But why wasn't there a field of study that included movies, or that included history? We can learn a lot from history about happiness. So I decided at that time, 2015, to help create a field of study around happiness, which was really an interdisciplinary field of study that will incorporate, of course, positive psychology. It will be an important element, part of it, but just one part. And that's what I've been doing. This is 8 years now. I launched the Happiness Studies Academy, which started by offering a certificate program, a year-long certificate program in happiness studies, once again incorporating all these disciplines and asking, what can they teach us about the good life? And then just less than a year ago, we launched the world's first master's degree in happiness studies, because my goal is that happiness studies will become a legitimate field, just like psychology is, or philosophy is, or history is, where universities will have departments that teach happiness studies at every level, undergrad, graduate, and graduate level.
Okay, so you said that you were doing positive psychology until 2015, which is when happiness studies began. But so that was when the field of study started for you. Maybe we should begin with how the field itself began, which, as you put it, came with Aristotle. So what were his specific contributions that made you think of him as the father of it all?
Yeah, so many of the questions that we face today. I mean, even, so once a week we meet for the certificate program, we meet for a live webinar. Even today I had a question about this. He made a very clear distinction between pleasure and happiness. So he defined what we call happiness today, which is, maybe more flourishing. He talks about eudaimonia. And, eudaimonia is not pleasure. And he explicitly makes the distinction between pleasure and flourishing. So many people today, when they talk about happiness, talk about it in the context of a mood. I was so happy having this ice cream. I was so happy being on the beach. That's not happiness as far as I'm concerned. And again, each to his or her own in terms of definitions. But that's pleasure. That's fun. Happiness is much deeper than that, and that is what Aristotle focused on. And consequently, because of that definition, he also understands happiness, the antecedents of happiness, as very different than what, I guess conventional wisdom would have us believe. He talks about it as, the antecedents being relationships, for example, friendship. And we know today, and you may have come across the Harvard study on happiness, where they followed people for 75 years, by now 85 years, and they found that the most important element of a happy life and of a healthy life, connection between mind and body, happy and healthy life, relationships. Whether it's romantic relationships or work relationships, or it can be friendship. It actually doesn't matter what kind of relationships, as long as there are deep, supportive relationships. Well, Aristotle talked about it 2,500 plus years ago. He talked about the importance of contemplation. Now, when I talk about happiness, one of the elements that I talk about is intellectual well-being, which is almost completely absent from discussion of happiness. Why? Because happiness is considered an emotion. Yeah, it's also an emotion, but that's, again, just part of it. So Aristotle had a much more holistic, holistic view of the good life, where he incorporated generosity, giving, kindness. He spent a lot of time talking about politics and how we are relative to other people. As important elements of happiness. And this is a kind of scholarship we need today. And again, scholarship not as an end in itself. Scholarship as a means towards an end, which is another Aristotelian focus. What is how do you actually use this for the purpose of bettering your life? This is, what the Greeks in general, not just Aristotle, were focused on, the good life. And unashamedly so.
Well, I do some philosophy myself, and I'm certainly of the opinion that philosophy is at its best when it's working in conjunction with other fields. So it's very nice to, one, hear that Aristotle's beliefs about the antecedents of happiness are confirmed 2,000 plus years later by work done at Harvard. And also, I'm very happy to hear about the synthesis that is happiness studies. So philosophy is situated in this constellation of other disciplines that are all working together holistically, WH. And I'd like to get back to this Harvard study on happiness, but I think that we should start with the very beginning in a different sense, just terminologically rather than historically. So our understanding of happiness has changed a lot since Aristotle, because as you mentioned, it's informed by whole bodies of neuroscience, history, literature, psychology, etc., that Aristotle and those who followed him didn't have. So when I say that I think we ought to start at the beginning, what I have in mind is a very crucial question, and that's, what is happiness? And it seems like one of those things that we all know the answer to, but that's very difficult to put into words. Yet I imagine there's a lot of disagreement over cases nonetheless. So doing heroin can make you happy in one sense, but make you quite miserable in another. So where I want to start with how it is that you go about disambiguating the word happiness that's at the center of happiness studies.
Yeah, of course, that's a very important question. And needless to say, this is, what the first class is about, whether it's a master's degree or a certificate or a lecture. So what is happiness? When we talk about definition, of course, they are to some extent in the eye of the beholder. How do you define a certain concept? So the definition that I'm going to share, I didn't receive it on any mountaintop, and I didn't fast for 40 days, and then it was revealed to me. This is a definition that relies on the works of Aristotle and Lao Tzu and Helen Keller and Marty Seligman and Sonia Lubomyrsky and Chinua Achebe. And African mythology and Greek mythology. So it really is an attempt, imperfect, but an attempt to integrate and synthesize the great works. And the great works, whether the great books, the great art from different cultures. So looking for a universal definition as much as possible, synthesized through my education, which is a very particular education, or a group of us that worked on it. So having said all that, here is a definition of happiness that we, the Happiness Studies Academy at least, work with. Happiness comprises 5 elements. The 5 elements of happiness are as follows. The first one is spiritual well-being. Spiritual well-being can, of course, be experienced and enjoyed in a place of worship through religion. However, spiritual well-being is first and foremost about a sense of meaning and purpose in life, and sense of presence and mindfulness. So we experience spiritual well-being when we're present in the moment, and or when we experience a sense of meaning and purpose. Spiritual well-being. Then there is physical well-being. Physical well-being is about exercise, for instance. It's about nutrition. It's about rest and recovery. These are all ways to increase our overall happiness, but specifically they fall under physical well-being. For instance, we know that regular exercise has the same effect on our psychological well-being. I'm not even talking about physical well-being, but on our psychological well-being, same effect as our most powerful psychiatric medication. In fact, working in the same way, releasing norepinephrine, serotonin, dopamine, the feel-good chemicals in the brain. We know how important nutrition is, not just for physical well-being, also for psychological well-being. Meaning, how much processed versus natural food do we eat? Do we, get our vegetables, our vitamins? That affects our mind just as it does our bodies. Then there is the third element. So we have spiritual well-being, physical well-being. The third element is intellectual well-being. And that's about reflection, contemplation. There's research showing, for instance, that people who are curious, who ask questions, who are learners, are not just happier, which they are. They're not just more successful. They are that too. They also live longer. So, curiosity may kill the cat. It does the opposite to humans. So that's intellectual well-being. And by the way, it doesn't have to be, learning text. It can be, studying art. It can be being very attentive to and studying and contemplating the nature of nature. But deep learning, curiosity are important elements of intellectual well-being. Then there is relational well-being. Relational well-being, as I mentioned earlier, number one predictor of happiness, quality time we spend with people we care about and who care about us. And that's about kindness and generosity. We know that when we help others, we're helping ourselves. That there's a lot of talk in ethics about egoism versus altruism, about selfishness versus selflessness. And I don't buy that schism, that distinction. I subscribe to self-fullness, which is about helping self and others. Because when we help others, we're contributing to our own well-being. And there's a lot of research showing that when I increase my own well-being, I actually become more generous and kinder. So it potentially is a self-reinforcing loop. Selffulness, generosity. So that's all under relational well-being. And the final element of happiness is emotional well-being. And that's about learning to deal with painful emotions, which are part and parcel of every life. And how you deal with it? Well, you can deal with it by through catharsis, which is something that Aristotle talked about in his Poetics, or you can experience it by through writing a journal or therapy. You deal with painful emotions, and another element of emotional well-being, of course, is cultivating pleasurable emotions like appreciation, like joy, like love. So you have these 5 elements, and they make up the acronym SPIRE. SPIRE: spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional well-being. So I wish I had a one-sentence definition of happiness. I do. Happiness is whole person well-being. But that's not, and by the way, it's a definition that I took from the work of Helen Keller, who says, to me, the only definition of happiness is happiness as wholeness. Again, WH, happiness as wholeness. So my definition is happiness is whole person well-being. But then if I break it down to its elements, which is very important, whole being, whole person well-being is spiritual, physical, intellectual, relational, and emotional well-being.
And then I'm sure that philosophy, history, and literature, just to take 3 of the fields within happiness studies, will quite easily confirm that we can draw these 5 distinctions between these 5 components of happiness. But do you also find, just to take for one example, since it's the field that you're most familiar with, positive psychology, that you can look at the research into positive psychology and parse findings about these 5 distinct components to happiness?
Yeah. Yes, and. So yes, I can. And what psychology can help us do is also explain to us why it's important to break down happiness into its components. So let me treat each one of these, the yes and then the and. Psychologists, based on the work of Aristotle primarily, make the distinction between eudaimonic and hedonic happiness. So eudaimonic would be more about a sense of meaning and purpose. Hedonic would be more about the experience of pleasure. And there are 2 distinct pursuits and experiences, and 2 that are very important for happiness. And let me give you an extreme example. So, the father of logotherapy is Viktor Frankl. Viktor Frankl, in his amazing book, Man's Search for Meaning, talks about his experience in a concentration camp in Auschwitz. And he says that he was more likely, or the inmates were more likely to survive if they found a sense of meaning and purpose in their life, a reason, something to live for. And it could be, I want to see my husband, wife when I come out, or family, or I want to write a certain book or tell the world about it, or whatever. But if they had a what to live for, they were more likely to overcome the hardship. So he talks about the importance of meaning, and that aligns with eudaimonia. But to suggest that people in Auschwitz or a concentration camp, or people living through war, even today, now as we speak, to suggest that they're happy would be a stretch. Would be insensitive, to put it mildly. So it's not just enough to have a purpose, a sense of meaning. You also need pleasure. And here we go to another giant of psychology, and that is Freud. Who talks about the pleasure principle, who talks about how important that is, how central it is, how central of a pursuit it is, which it is. Now, at the same time, without a sense of meaning and purpose, just, experiencing pleasure, whether it's, sex, drugs, or rock and roll, that's not enough for a happy life. And we know that because there are all too many examples of people who burned out on the hedonic treadmill. So just that is not enough. What you need, perhaps, is some sort of a combination. I would argue you'd need other things as well. But at the very least, what Freud prescribed and what Frankl prescribed, the hedonic and the eudaimonic. And psychology, the research shows how important they are. Neuroscience research related to positive psychology also shows that we experience them in different parts of the brain. We have the emotional brain, we have the the rational or thinking brain, so to speak. And again, it's all interconnected, of course, but we can make that distinction. So that's what we can learn from and incorporate from the field of psychology. And by the way, I've always been for an interdisciplinary approach. In a sense, I've been for going back to what philosophy was about. Because, Aristotle was a philosopher. But today, would you put him? Which department? Because, he wrote a book about poetics. So would you put him in a literature department? He wrote about happiness. So would you put him in a psych department? He, of course, was a philosopher, so you probably put him in a philosophy department. But, he also studied animals. So maybe a biologist. No, he was a philosopher. Because then, at that time, it was an interdisciplinary field. He was also a mathematician. That's the foundation that he got when he studied with his teacher, that Plato. So it was really interdisciplinary. And in a sense, I'm talking about happiness studies today. I didn't make this connection before, but, maybe it's my way of returning to Plato and Aristotle, to their schools. Maybe I should have called my school Lyceum as opposed to Happiness Studies Academy. But yeah.
You could be in much worse company than Plato and Aristotle, but this is all great. And I'd like to now move into the contributions that some of these fields make to the whole. And despite this unifying definition of happiness that you capture with the SPIRE acronym, are there still nonetheless crucial dimensions in which various of the fields that contribute to happiness conceive of their subject differently? So for instance, I imagine that an animal psychologist researching happiness might take a drastically different approach from a neuroscientist attempting to identify the neural correlate of the conscious experience of happiness.
Yeah, for sure. So let me give a few examples. let me start with film. I love movies, and for various reasons. First of all, because I enjoy them. Second, because I learn from them. Third, because they potentially have a real impact. When there's been an attempt for many years in the field, in physics, to find this one formula, the unifying theory of everything. And Einstein was looking for it. I'm assuming that Oppenheimer was looking for it. I know that Max Planck and Marie Curie were looking for it. No one really found it, and maybe it's above our pay grade as human beings, and we'll never find it. But there's been an attempt, and there are attempts, unsuccessful. In psychology, there is a unifying theory, and the unifying theory of psychology, and also by extension of happiness studies, is stories. If you think about it, wherever you look in psychology, you find stories. What is therapy about? Therapy is about me, sitting in an office and basically telling my story, and I feel so much better afterwards as a result. There's a lot of research on journaling for the same reason. Helps us a great deal overcome hardships, deal with anxiety, solve problems, interpersonal problems. Why? Because we tell a story by journaling, writing about it. Think about cognitive psychology. A large part of the field of cognitive psychology deals with memory. What do we remember well or better? Not facts, not statistics. We remember stories. Our brains are wired towards stories. That's what we absorb, assimilate, connect to. Think about leadership, organizational psychology. The great leaders, what's unique about them? They're storytellers. Think about the most influential books throughout history. Certainly in the West, it's the Bible. And, whether you think it was the Word of God or written by people, it's an extremely influential book. What is the Bible? It's a collection of stories. So in terms of impact, so everywhere you look in psychology, you see stories, narrative at the center. Now, this is the power of film. A film tells you a story. And what it does, and where I find, when I teach happiness, where it contributes so much, is I can take a very complicated theory, or even a number of theories. I can take the 5 Spire elements and demonstrate it all through a movie, or movies. So when I would show a movie like Adam's Rib, which is a 1940s movie with Spencer Tracy and Katharine Hepburn. Their relationship is a microcosm for all relationships. Not only that, I can talk about the R of Spire. I can very much talk about the E of Spire, because both of them experience the full range of human emotions, from joy and love and ecstasy to anger and hatred. And I do that through one movie, an hour and a half, and I can have these conversations. I can certainly talk about intellectual well-being, because Adam's Rib, just look at the name. It's taken from, Adam and Eve. They fight with each other. And as a result of them fighting with each other, being a help meet to each other, they grow intellectually. They learn about themselves, about the case, about the world. So you can learn so much from stories in movies, or stories, in a very short period of time. You have you can delve into real depth, consciously and subconsciously. That's why when people say, I ask them, so did you watch whatever, Spartacus, one of my favorite movies. And they said, yeah, I saw it. Do you want to watch it again together? And I said, no, I've already seen it. The depth you can go in, it's like a piece of music, good music. Do you listen to it once? No, you listen to it over and over again. It's the same with movies, because you can go deeper and deeper intellectually, and through that, explore the spiral element. So that's the unique thing about movies, stories. The unique thing, of course, about neuroscience is that we're getting we have an audience with something that Aristotle didn't have. We're looking into a person's brain. Today, we know what a happy brain looks like. We know what a depressed brain, a compassionate brain looks like. Now, what we are seeing today is nothing. We're beginners. Is nothing compared to what we're going to see, I suspect, even 5 years from now, let alone 10 years from now. The insights that we could have through that about the behavior of particular neurons, and, as far as I'm concerned, more importantly, what we can do to affect those neurons. We're going to be able to be much more precise about our prescriptions in terms of what will contribute to your happiness, what will contribute to this element or that element of happiness. So that's neuroscience breaking down our understanding. And animal psychology is also important, because yes, we are also, again, Aristotle, we are rational animals. So yeah, we're rational, and we also have the amygdala, the limbic system, or the reptile brain, the mammalian brain. That's also part of who we are. So we better understand that too. That's why we need, the interdisciplinary approach to learn from the movies which only humans can make, and to learn from that one cell, the neuron, and to learn from, those animals. And on and on.
There are some disciplines within happiness studies whose impacts on our understanding of happiness have me particularly curious. And one of those is anthropology, which I'm sure has made many contributions. But to start off, what do we know about happiness in different nations and cultures across the world? And what does this tell us about the nature of happiness as common to all of us?
Yeah, so important, Robinson, because when we think about happiness, we need to think about it at three particular levels. The first level would be the universal level, and that is what is identical to all people, all places, all times. All people, all places, all times needed a sense of meaning and purpose. That's why, we see the search for, whether it's a god or a reason for being, or the prime mover, or, you call it whatever you want. We see it from time immemorial in the art and in the literature and in the philosophy that we encounter. Every place, everywhere, every time needed to move, to exercise. The movie WALL-E, which is a very important movie, shows us what will happen if we don't move. The dystopia of all of us becoming, blobs. We need to move, and we always needed to move. And even in the post-remote control world, or order everything online, we still need to move. Maybe we don't need to hunt and gather, but movement is necessary. So these are some of the universals. And again, the spiral elements are universal. But then there is also the cultural. And there are real cultural differences. And in terms of whether we find our meaning from individual pursuits or more collective pursuits, what our relationships are about. Are they more, are we more cognizant of, respectful of hierarchies, or are we more, oriented towards, equality and a flat organizational community? these are real cultural differences, and you need to take them into consideration when you're prescribing for yourself or for others from a particular culture. But that's not enough to understand how to prescribe happiness or how to fully understand our needs as it relates to the good life. The third element, in addition to the universal and the cultural, is the personal. Because the personal is important too. And there are individual differences. So two people raised in the same culture, sometimes even in the same home. My wife and I often talk about this. We have 3 kids, 3 teenagers, and we often look at them and at their behaviors and we say, isn't it amazing? The 3 of them, same production line, so very different. So the individual differences matter, because what I enjoy as physical exercise is different than what my, sister does. What I find meaningful in my life is very different than what my brother finds meaningful, even though, again, same production line, same culture, certainly part of the same universe. So these are the 3 elements we need to look at. Now, for the universal and the cultural, we have research, and some great research, and again, mounting by the day. Very important. For the third one, the personal, we don't need research. We need me-search. Which is why a very important part of all of the classes that I teach is journaling. Again, going back to Aristotle, reflection, contemplation. Look inside yourself. And it's by doing so that we build on the research which is universal, the research which is cultural, and we create as much as possible a model of what it is that would make us happy. Or if I'm working as a therapist or a coach, or if I'm a parent or a teacher, what would make that person or those people happier? We need to look at those 3 levels, which is why, going back to your question, second level is the cultural. Why anthropology is so important, the study of culture. I'll give you an example, a book. This is a popular book, but I think my anthropologist friends or colleagues would not be too happy with me. But, look at the book called Lila by Robert M. Pirsig. So Robert M. Pirsig wrote the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. His second book, not as well known, to my mind, as good as the first one, is called Lila. And Lila is an anthropological study of Native Americans. And it's fascinating because he talks about, one of the things that he talks about was the approach towards silence. And we in the West feel very uncomfortable in silence, with the absence of words. And that's why we invented small talk. And, we always have something to say and, fill the void. And yet the Native Americans, he would say, when he lived with them, at least according to the book, they would spend a long time just chilling, hanging, just saying nothing, sitting, around that bonfire and, looking at each other, smiling, nodding, going back inside themselves, reflecting. And silence was okay. Now, they feel more comfortable in silence than we do, who were raised in a traditional, say, Western home or American or European home. And yet we can learn a lot from it because there is so much value to silence. Blaise Pascal says that, and I'm butchering this a little bit, but to paraphrase him, he says, most of the world's problems are a result of men's inability to sit quietly in his own room or in solitude in his room. We need to learn to be in silence. Children need to learn how to be bored. Not turn to that screen, on automatically when we, not just children, adults too. We don't know what it is to be in silence, to look inside or to observe outside. So this is where we can learn from one example of many, where we can learn from other cultures. Another example, and we just spoke about this last week in our MA class, the concept of Ubuntu. I am because you are. It's an African, but it's considered the foundation of African ethics. It's about saying, I see you. It's saying even more than that. It's saying, I am because of you. It's acknowledging the interdependence, interconnectedness among people. How important is that? Now in the West, we talk about systems thinking, how everything is interconnected. Well, Bohr talked about it in physics. Peter Senge, the organizational psychologist from MIT, talks about it. Margaret Wheatley talks about it. Well, in Africa, it's one of their pillars of their culture that you can learn about in their mythology, in their philosophy. And how important is this concept, especially in today's broken world, to introduce ideas like that? So through the study of anthropology, through the study of culture, we can learn so much. This is why I'm a big proponent of the great works approach, great books from different cultures.
Okay, well, there's a lot there, but for the moment, I'm going to single out one thing. So you mentioned this question a few minutes ago of the relationship between hierarchy and happiness. And I spoke a month or two ago with Nicholas Christakis of Yale, whose work I know with James Fowler on social networks you've cited, and maybe we'll come back to that. But Nicholas Christakis also wrote a book about what makes, or what the cultural universals are of successful cultures. So what makes a good society. And one of the things he identified is that not extreme hierarchy, so we don't want tyrants, but all good operating functional societies, and I don't want to put these words into his mouth because I'm sure that he would have a much better way of putting it than I do, but they all have, and this is his phrase, mild hierarchy involved somewhere. And the question that I'm particularly curious about, and I'm not sure whether this ought to fall under anthropology or some other category, is how, on your reading, happiness is connected to the socioeconomic system under which a person lives. And I'm wondering here about capitalism, socialism, communism, and the like. And just to add a little bit more context to why I'm curious about this. One, I interviewed the Marxist economist Richard Wolff recently, who is very adamantly anti-capitalist and pro-socialist. And then the other reason is I'm currently reading a book on the history of genocide. And particularly in the 20th century, a tremendous proportion of these massive genocides, I have in mind right now the communist genocides in Russia, Cambodia, China, and then some of the anti-communist genocides that were a result of this, all stemmed from, I think, at root, ideas about whether society ought to be organized around or in a communist structure, a socialist structure, a capitalist structure. And these sorts of arguments presumably ultimately hinge on beliefs about happiness within this sort of structure.
Right. Yeah, look, there's obviously a lot to say here. Some of it is, will reflect, normative rather than positive values. But there still is a lot of empirical evidence that is worth mentioning. And the first one is, if you look at the happiest countries in the world, or if you look at the ranking and you look at the least happy countries in the world, there are countries that are either communist countries or ex-communist countries. So the impact of communism has not just been for the time that it was there. It actually follows the generations after. Now, as people are hearing this, as many people from philosophy departments hear this argument, they would say, but, look at what capitalism has done. And, just look at the history of the 19th century. And again, the capitalist would respond to that, well, capitalism inherited rather than created poverty. And, that's at least in part a valid point. Now let me get to the normative and my perspective. I am a strong supporter of conscious capitalism, and the conscious capitalist movement talks about a very simple fact. Capitalism has liberated millions and billions of people from poverty. Capitalist countries are far less likely to enter into war than non-capitalist countries. People are happier. Again, you gave the extreme example of genocide. Genocide will more likely take place when you fight human nature, which is what communism and socialism does, rather than when you work with human nature. And yes, as Adam Smith pointed out, we have this innate desire to succeed, to grow, to prosper. And in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that. There is something wrong with that when it comes at the expense of, when we put other people down. And that's where conscious capitalism comes in, because conscious capitalism emphasizes a lot of the elements that we know are not just part of human nature, they're also the higher part of human nature. For example, a sense of meaning and purpose. When you look at thieves rarely want their children to be thieves. They want their children to go to, college and, get a respectable job. And a respectable job is one where you do well yourself and you contribute to others. Yes, we have the selfish gene, but then we also have the generous gene. That's why, again, I don't subscribe to that. You're either selfish or selfless. You're self-full. This is what I think that conscious capitalism is all about. It's bringing these two ideas together. So am I happy with cutthroat, robber baron approach to the free market? No. Do I think that capitalism has proven to be a lot more effective than socialism? Absolutely yes. And to my mind, conscious capitalism takes the best of both worlds. Looks at human nature, looks at our higher nature and focuses on that and accentuates that.
Well, thanks a lot for humoring me, because I think that was a rather esoteric question relative to the broader approach we've been taking to happiness studies in this conversation. But for the little time we have left, I'd like to shift gears slightly. And you mentioned earlier this very long Harvard study on happiness. And with that in mind, I'm wondering what some of the landmark studies in positive psychology have taught us, with a particular eye to the, I guess, prescriptive dimensions that they have. So what might people do actionably? I mean, there are lots of things that people can do to be happy. They can make millions and millions of dollars, but that's not something that just anybody can do.
But even that, that would not be on my prescriptions, even if I could choose anything that I wanted. Mm-hmm. Money is important to an extent, to a certain point. If the difference between making $200,000 a year and $200 million a year is actually not that significant in terms of happiness. So there are things that do more now.
But it's still quite difficult. I mean, a lot of people aren't making $200,000 even. So I'm just saying the things that are, what have these studies told us about happiness and the more achievable things that people can do?
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. So, in terms of the more achievable things, I'm going to give you some things that I'm sure you and others have heard of. There isn't, rocket science here. The difficulty is the implementation, not the understanding. So I can say a few words about implementation after, but first of all, understanding what are the things. So one of the things, and this is probably the most cited study in the field of psychology or set of studies, is about gratitude, appreciation. It's no coincidence that in just about every religion and every philosophical system, gratitude is a virtue. Cicero called gratitude the mother of all virtues. And more recent work than Cicero's by Emmons and McAuliffe shows that people who express gratitude on a regular basis are happier, healthier, their immune system actually strengthens, they are more generous, kinder towards others, and they're more successful. So gratitude is certainly a prescription. What does that look like? It could be every night before going to bed, write down 3 to 5 things that you're grateful for, big things and little things. Could be, your mom and something that you had for lunch. Okay, so gratitude. Physical exercise. The research coming out on physical exercise, and I'm not exaggerating, by the day, is literally and metaphorically mind-boggling. The impact that exercise has. I'm not a therapist. No, I teach. But if I were a therapist working one-on-one with people, the first question that I would ask them, my client, or rather the second question, the first question would be their name. The second question would be, are you exercising? Are you moving? Because it is, it's critical, obviously, for physical and for psychological well-being. So that's something else that is important. We're becoming better also at understanding what kind of exercise. So we know, for instance, that high intensity interval training, which is getting our pulse, heart rate up, and then letting it drop, and then up again, 3-4 times, 3-4 sets, which can take, by the way, a total of 10 minutes, can go a long way in improving our physical and mental health. More research on acts of kindness, being deliberate about kindness. And people would say, oh, but this should be, acts of kindness should be spontaneous, and acts of kindness should be it should come when you really feel like. No, it shouldn't. If it does, wonderful. But acts of kindness can also be very deliberate, and you can set your alarm clock for noon to remind you to be kind. That's perfectly fine, perfectly legit, and even important. Because the more we do it mechanically, the more likely we will integrate it, quite literally, into who we are. So this notion of you fake it until you make it, or you fake it until you become it, it's real. So there's a lot of research on kindness. I mentioned earlier journaling. The Oracle of Delphic, know thyself. That's so important, and we do it through research. And the method that we know for that is through journaling, through reflection. There's a lot of research by Jamie Pennebaker, by Laura King, and others. Cross-cultural research, by the way, so universal, on the value of expressing rather than suppressing our thoughts and our emotions. More research on increasing levels of well-being is acceptance. So we know, for instance, that happiness levels, they peak relative to, again, this is all average. Of course, there are many individual differences, but they peak relative to where we were before. They're in our 20s. And then they go down, and they go down and down. And then when we're in our late 40s, that's when they begin to go up again. And when we're 50s, they continue to go up. And they continue also in our 60s and our 70s, potentially, again, controlling for severe, chronic, dangerous, or painful illnesses. And the question is why? Why is it, we're not as beautiful as we were, we're not as strong as we were, and yet we become happier as we age? For a very simple reason that every person who's matured knows, and that is acceptance. Accepting our nature, accepting the ups and the downs, giving ourselves the permission to be human, rather than seeking that superhuman performance, abilities, looks. So learning to accept ourselves when we're in our teens or 20s or 50s, learning to accept ourselves is an important part of fulfilling our happiness potential.
The last thing that I'm going to ask, getting back to where we started, I think is a good place to end. And that is, do you know now, or do you understand now, why you were so miserable as an undergraduate student? And then this is a bigger question, but it's also one that you raised earlier, though maybe we won't get to it. And that is, why are we here?
Okay, let me actually start with the second one, because it's easier to answer.
I'm surprised.
Why are we here? Why are we here? That's above my pay grade.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
As a psychologist and as a philosopher. But Robinson, if you have the answer, please, I'm dying to know, but I'm not prepared to die to know. But in terms of do I know why I wasn't happy? Yes, I do. And one reason is because I was raised, and again, it's not my parents, or it's not just my parents, it's not my teachers, or not just my teachers, but the society I grew up in. Basically, it's in the ether, in the air, is the fact that to be happy, you need to be successful. That, that's how most parents raise their children. Even if you ask them, what's the most important thing for you, or for your children? They would say, I want them to be happy. And yet, de facto, they are raising their children to be successful, to get into the top school, to make a lot of money. Why? Because they actually believe that it's by being successful, by getting into this college, or by getting this job, or by making this amount of money, or by, living there and owning these things, then they'll be happy. At the age of, 22, I was a very, very successful student, one of the top universities in the world. I was already working during the summers. I had an amazing summer job, making a lot of money for a 22-year-old. I was a top athlete, having played professional squash. I checked the boxes, certainly relative to that age, and I was miserable because I believed that these things, or if not these things, the next things, the next milestone is what will make me happy. And I realized it was only years later that I was experiencing what I've come to call the arrival fallacy. The arrival fallacy is the false belief that when you arrive somewhere, then you'll be happy. That's the myth of Sisyphus. You get to the top of the mountain and, all that happens, it's actually Sisyphus 2.0. Because it's not just that you have to, push that rock up the same mountain. The mountain gets steeper and steeper. Because if I win a particular tournament as a professional athlete and think that is what would make me happy, I get there, I'm not happy. It's not enough for me to win the same tournament again. I need, a bigger prize the next time. So, it's the incline, it becomes steeper and steeper, Sisyphus 2.0. So that's the main thing, the success trap, or the arrival fallacy. The other thing is that I actually believed that it was possible to be happy all the time. So if you had asked me then, why are you starting to study philosophy and psychology? My answer would be, so that I can finally be happy. And that meant happy all the time. That meant an unbroken chain of pleasurable emotions. And that, of course, is an enemy of happiness, because we all do experience painful emotions at times. And paradoxically, it's when we accept and embrace these emotions that they are most likely to leave us. They do not overstay their welcome. And when we fight them and reject them, that's when they intensify and grow strong.
Well, Tal, I can certainly empathize with the pain and struggle of falling into this arrival fallacy and engaging in this Sisyphean labor. But I think this was a great end, and this has been a great introduction to happiness studies and a launching point as well, I think, for future conversations on the show about the specific contributions of all the various fields to happiness studies. So neuroscience, philosophy, positive psychology, because all of these things could fill up plenty of airspace. But thank you so much for doing this with me. It was really fun.
Thank you, Robinson. For me too.
Hold on. If you haven't subscribed, liked, commented, or reviewed, that would be so helpful. And if you haven't yet, you could also follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Robinson Earhart.